And we're live. And June is drinking. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Footnotes podcast. Today we have a special guest with us today, Alex. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me on. My name is Alex. I used to work with June. I guess that's how we formed this connection. And yeah, I just finished up my master's in geography. And I was looking at food systems and complexity science and the interrelations thereof. And yeah, and a lot of what you guys talk about has a lot of resonance with the stuff that I've been researching. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, so Alex and I worked at it's an organization called Neighbor to Neighbor. It's a local food bank in Hamilton that's expanded to offering a lot of other services, and that's where we met 3 years ago. And
Yes.
we've been keeping in touch from time to time. And I see Alex pop up, in some of the places I go. So it's always good to see you again. So we just wanted to ask you a little bit more about your master's project.
Sure.
Could you give us a brief overview of what it was like?
Yeah, sure. I haven't thought about it. I've turned my brain off for the last month since I defended, so I'm gonna have to reach back in there and pull it out. But yeah, the basic gist of it was I was interested in looking at local food systems in particular. And this was based on a working paper by a committee member of mine, Stephen Quilley. And in this paper, he argued that there were two ways that local food systems in particular were moving. And the one direction was this really like capital intensive sci-fi sort of direction, things like vertical farming, clean meat synthesis, plants, that kind of direction. And then in the opposite direction, there's this, I shouldn't say the opposite, but the other direction, there is this sort of return to more local and natural methods of production, things like agroecology, community gardens, and that kind of direction. And so what I was really interested in looking at was what are some of the values and what are some of the practices of the current forms of these operations that are taking place. And so to do that, I talked to various farmers and urban planners and the like, and to sort of just get a gist of what are some of the reasons why they're producing food, what do they consider to be local food, and yeah, all these other kind of broader questions. And I guess what I found was that across these two different types of organizations, or two different types of food production operations, sorry, they were really sort of pragmatic in the sense that they adopted a lot of principles that are quote unquote from conventional agricultural systems, while also adopting a lot of quote unquote alternative principles from alternative food systems. And I found this was really interesting when we're talking about, social innovation and changing the system, and from this complexity science lens, like generating novelty and emergence. What is the tension between sort of these more pragmatic approaches that borrow from conventional systems, but also alternative systems, and what are the potential impacts for that in the future of local food production?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of the principles, values, either from the conventional or the alternative systems that we should be aware about?
Sorry, that's a key piece. I was looking at things like efficiency. So how do you define efficiency? Does it involve things like scaling up production, automation, replacing human labor with robots and that kind of stuff? Efficiency, local food. So how do you actually define local? Is being a local food operation something that's important to you? A third sort of characteristic was, do you participate in sort of commodity markets, or are you sort of exchanging food with your neighbors or coworkers or others within your sort of circle, that kind of stuff. So I think, if I had to distill it to three particular values, it was efficiency, sort of this definition and emphasis on local, and that third piece of how do you actually exchange food? Is it this commodified relationship, or is it something a little more, community focused or community oriented?
Mm-hmm. And like your assessment of the current state of, like, I guess the food system would be something like the values are very shifted, focused on efficiency and commodification, and not much of a emphasis on the value of local exchange, things like that.
Yeah, I would say, sorry.
Yeah, so like what does the current food system look like right now, and like what problems does it have? I guess that would be like something good to I don't know, develop a shared understanding of before we go on.
Yeah, sure. So I can sort of back up a bit. And in the first chapter of my thesis, I talk about complexity theory and how that relates to industrial food system processes and whatnot. And I think that might be a good starting point. So, yeah, as I've listened to your guys' other shows, and you talk a lot about food and you talk about complexity. And so I won't belabor this point, but yeah, industrial food system is very complex. It's like this open and dynamic food system that has all these sort of emergent properties and these nonlinear thresholds. And we saw, for example, I talk a lot about a case study of the Irish potato famine through a complexity science lens, and how, because it was all this same crop, same type of agricultural systems, the blight spread through it really rapidly. And so we're seeing kind of these same patterns throughout the world today. Following the financial crisis, there was a massive drought in Russia, and it devastated wheat production across the world. And so, yeah, all these different case studies showed just how sort of potentially vulnerable, anyway, industrial food system processes are. And so, yeah, the way I kind of framed things was looking at, hey, what are some of the alternatives, and how might they be more or less vulnerable to these similar vulnerabilities?
Right. So like the big problem in the famine examples would be that a lot of the need for food was a lot of it was dependent on very undiverse sources of fuel or food.
Yeah.
So if an entire population is dependent on a certain strain of potatoes, then one disease goes through those strains, and your food system's kind of gone.
Yeah.
So it seems to me right now that we have a lot of those kind of same dependencies on a lot of specialized and interconnected sources of production, so that when we're hit with big upcoming changes that are predictable or unpredictable, maybe there'll be like a superbug going through like strains of wheats or the effects of climate change. We're going to be very vulnerable to volatility and not good things happening in our food system. So we've been trying to, like, Paul and I, we don't know too much about like the alternative food system. I don't think we've had much exposure to it. So what are some of the ways do you think, like, just ordinary people who don't really know what's going on, with the new food movements, let's say, can, what could they learn, or what could we learn more about?
It's a great question. And yeah, I still don't know. I still don't even know as much as I should about the alternative food sector, but I can try to answer that. I would say if we think in terms of systems, and that's one way to think about it, the quote unquote conventional food system paradigm is, it's conventional, or it's industrialized, it's emphasizing commodity production, it's very centralized and consolidated. And so when we think of alternatives to that, we can start to sort of generate a particular vocabulary, things like decentralized, or things like agroecological, and things like sharing food as a common resource versus a commodified resource, for example. And so I think what I learned throughout this process was that alternative, it means a whole lot of things to a whole lot of different people, and it can borrow from both conventional and these alternative paradigms. And so the particular, how I defined alternative, for example, was, and some examples of organizations that I interviewed that I would classify as alternative were, for example, an aquaponics food bank. So it kind of blends these like new forms of technology, but with this focus on distributing to the broader public. Other examples might be, agroecological farms that operate on a commons basis. They go against this sort of logic of commodity production. I'm trying to think of other examples. But yeah, just these sort of new ways of combining different values, but also different methods of production to sort of say, hey, things don't have to be this certain way. So that's, I guess, the first takeaway. But the second takeaway that I also learned was that we don't have to just sort of piece together different parts of what is already out there. So, for example, you don't have to piece together, currently available technologies and new ways to classify something as alternative. There are lots of things that have yet to be invented or imagined or thought of. And so I think that's kind of that exciting part of complexity that really adds a cool lens to this definition of alternative, the idea that, there are things and there are ways of doing things that we haven't even thought of yet that might present themselves as better alternatives in the future.
And in your opinion, how open are people to adopting these sort of alternative food systems?
Well, that's the question. It's hard to say. I found that all the people I talked to, they're wonderful people, and a lot of them were very open to considering new ways of doing things. They were experimenting with new production technologies, new ways of distributing food. So I think on like a very, if you're talking about scale, on a very like small scale, like people are very interested in experimenting with these new things. On a more top-down level, if we're thinking of like, is the government interested in these novel explorations of food production? I don't know if I'm particularly qualified to talk about it myself, but from what I observed and from the people I talked to, there's definitely a lot of interest. There's a lot of public-private partnerships, that are happening that represent new ways of going about producing food. So I'm overly optimistic. However, at the same time, because we're talking about systems and because we're talking about complexity, things are very entrenched, and there are particular ways of doing things that have had success in certain respects. And the industrial food system, I have a full belly all the time. It's been pretty nice to me. And so there are certain reasons why it still dominates and why it's still quote unquote useful. So those systemic barriers to change, they still they kind of dominate, and they sort of frame this overarching framework, but I'm optimistic that it could change.
Yeah, and on that point, I wanted to point out, because when I think about the food that I get, I know that I'm benefiting a lot from the current food system, and like you said, like my stomach's always full. And so when I talk to people about these alternative methods, there's definitely interest. It's like, wow, cool, vertical farming or aquaponics, like that sounds really fascinating. But when it comes to actual change, people are very hesitant because, the current system seems very comfortable. It seems very satisfying. So you talked about a few barriers there. Do you have any ideas of how we could overcome those? I know that's a huge question that probably would solve everything, but any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good question. I I don't know if I have any particular thing. Besides sort of saying this, this very general blanket statement that it requires some kind of social change in the norms and how we treat food. Yeah, I'm interested to hear. Yeah, no, I'm interested to hear your guys' thoughts on this. What do you think?
Yeah, like so I think the bit you brought up at the end about changing our relationship to food and to nature in general is a really key point because right now in our current industrial food system, we treat food as commodity. It's produced somewhere. I don't know how it comes or gets to my grocery store, but I see it. I can pay like $2-3 for it, and I have it. It's mine, and I can eat it. And you know, because of that whole line of production that's separating us from the actual source of production, nature, we don't really feel any sorts of attachment to our food. And I think there would be a value of being closer to the site of production, even if it didn't mean that you were the one producing your own food. Now I could definitely see the value in that, but I do think that ties into a bigger theme of like how is it that we should relate to nature, like how is it best conceptualized, like or like what should our lives look like in relationship to it, because for me at least right now it's something like nature is pretty. It's nice to have around. um, we shouldn't completely destroy it because we'll be destroyed too. But I get the sense that there's more to this relationship that I haven't, let's say, discovered yet, or that I should be exploring more. I was wondering what your thoughts were on what should the proper relationship between like nature and humans look like.
Those are really interesting thoughts, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot, especially going through, this research. And just to kind of, before I answer that question, to go back on what you just said, yeah, I think that, I don't know, if food is something sort of sacred. It's something that we kind of, we definitely take for granted in this sort of very commodified, industrialized food system. And part of my research, what I was really interested in looking at also was, how do producers relate to nature, and how do producers relate to the land, and how do they emphasize this sort of sacredness to food? And what I found was that on the side of the more capital intensive vertical farming, aquaponics, well, it's kind of an interesting spot because they sort of recognize, they're like, this way that we treat food is very unnatural. We're putting them in these laboratories where, we're putting them under this purple UV light, like completely removed from nature, so to speak. But this is something that we feel is important and needs to be done. And the one that I was really interested in talking about was this one individual I interviewed. He was a vertical farm researcher, but he would not eat any sort of meat products that weren't produced from like an actual living animal. And so I thought that was kind of like an interesting comparison on that naturalness part of it. But yeah, I think that's a huge dimension of social change that would be required. Nature more broadly, yeah, I don't know. I have that very North American like wilderness fetish where I kind of run up to the boonies every weekend, and I want to live off the grid, and yeah, I think part of what I'm really interested in looking at too is how we incorporate nature in the city. And for people like myself, or people who've grown up in cities, how do we get access to nature, and how do we get access to food production in the city? And I think that's potentially one avenue that could be an interesting direction.
Mm-hmm. I mean, like coming from Korea, I don't know if you've noticed in your trip to China, but like I guess going to Korea for the summer and like seeing the cityscape there, and then coming back to Toronto or Hamilton. I actually think Canada does a much better job of integrating nature like into the neighborhoods, like into the cityscape. So like you won't see like all these big trees in the middle of neighborhoods in Korea. It's just concrete and apartment buildings. Or like I guess I should go to Singapore. I guess that'd be the model of how to incorporate nature within an urban setting. But I have this kind of like romantic notion or idea that like the proper like way to conceptualize nature is as like the mother, like mother nature, and like if we act in a way that's like reflective of like that kind of relationship, then something fruitful, something generative could come out of it. Do you see a role in like that kind of symbolic framing? Do you think that has any potential going forwards?
Absolutely. One of my colleagues, she's just writing up her thesis, and I read a very, very small snippet of it, but she's citing this paper that basically it talks about symbols, and it talks about the symbol of Earth as a mother, and sort of in contrast to this other view of nature as this dead, inert thing to be manipulated. And I think that, yeah, that has huge potential. Sorry, on a side note though, why do you think it is that nature is incorporated so differently into the city in some place like Korea versus here?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think the biggest thing is density. Korea is on land mass 100 times smaller than Canada, but has 20 million more people living inside it. So I guess the density makes the need for like very compact apartment buildings side by side. That kind of development really doesn't leave much room for nature. I think around Korea's geography, like 70% of South Korea anyway, is just mountains. So there are like mountain landscapes, but they're very separate from the cities and the apartment complexes. So there's a kind of segregation of nature and human activity, which I think makes sense in the Korean context and how Korea developed post-war from one of the poorest nations to like a very rapidly industrializing nation now. So yeah, so that's kind of why it's different. But
Gotcha.
yeah.
And one question for both of you, I was just thinking of, and something that I don't have an answer to, and I've been trying to figure out. What is the relationship between, food and nature, and why is it so important? Because why can't we just, why is food something that we automatically go to when we think about human nature and that interaction versus something like, I don't know, sports or water or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, so this is an interesting experience. When was it? I think it was 3 or 4 days ago. And I was like high on weed. Like we're watching TV and like we're watching TV. I think we're watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine. There was like a particularly attractive female character that was like exposing a lot of cleavage. And for like in that state of mind, like this is very random, it might be inappropriate, but like in that state of mind, in that state of consciousness, where I don't know exactly what's happening, but the first association that came to mind was like food. And like and I don't mean that in like a perverse way. I mean that like I don't know, there was something fundamental about me that like recognized that as like food, nourishment. There was that web of associations that was like immediately kind of generated within me. And I think, this is like a hypothesis, but like that may be like one of the primary like relationships we have with like the earth, or like the idea of like the maternal. It's something that bears fruit, and something that provides nourishment. Like when we're born into this world, like that's I think that's the first relationship you have to your mother, or like to something nourishing in your environment. So, I can see Paul laughing, but probably it wasn't the best example to illustrate this. But I think there's a rich history of symbolism of the Mother Earth being a source of nourishment, being a fertile source of from where like food emerges, and where we're like where we eat in or taken care by that source. So
when June prefaces something by "This will be interesting," then
that's when you know.
That's cool.
Well, I kind of agree with June, but I'm not gonna tell a story about that. But I feel like what maybe you're getting at is it's this sort of primal, what do you call it? Need. Like food is something that touches on a very fundamental need that we all have, right? And so maybe when you were seeing that woman, your appetite went up, and you started to think about food and all these basic needs that need to be filled. And I agree with that in the sense that, when I think about nature and the things in nature, food always comes to mind because it's so integrated in nature, and it's also very much integrated in the sense that there's a lot of things going on there when you're experiencing food, right? It's a multimodal experience. You're getting a physiological feedback, you're getting psychological feedback, you're becoming satisfied, you're being satiated. You think about food all the time because you need to eat all the time. So it's a very involved thing, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're so in tune with it. And one of the reasons why I think I wanted to make a point about why symbolism may be an answer to having a better relationship with nature, and thereby a better relationship with food, is that a lot of the times we don't think enough about nature, and we don't think enough about what consequences our actions have on nature and on food and the way we treat food. So, for example, I was walking down the street the other day, and I saw this empty box of granola bars just lying on the street, and it looked exactly like the box of granola bars that I had like a week ago. And I'm thinking there, like as I'm walking past it, I'm thinking, wow, that might actually be mine. Like it might have fell out of the recycling bin, it might have flown into the air, and it ended up on the street. And I would never have known about it unless I really considered that connection. And so when we throw things out, for example, we don't consider what the journey of that waste product goes through. Like, well, we don't know where that goes. It just sort of disappears, and we never see it again. And so I think one of the ways that we can bring back the connection that we have with nature is realizing the impacts that we have when we interact with nature, and when we go about our lives and operate. And I think symbolism might be a way to that. I'm a little skeptical about symbolism, as June already knows. I think it's a nice story, but I'm not always able to internalize it and personalize it. But as I said before, I think it's important for us to be more considerate about our actions, and not to forget what consequences they might have. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Gene.
I mean that. I was just gonna say kind of food kind of pops up out of nowhere, and then you eat it, you dispose it, and then it goes into nowhere.
Exactly.
That's that's how. That's a very kind of selfish mode of existence. Things come to me, I eat it, and then it goes somewhere, and I don't care. It's very strange, but it's the way we live.
Mm.
On a side note, right now I'm kind of like in an inter-school period, and I got a job, and I'm quote unquote a food waste auditor, and literally what that involves me doing is going through people's trash and sorting out what could be avoided and unavoided. And I'd never really, like, food waste is just such like a whole new ball game for me. I never really understood how big of an issue or challenge it is and how much goes into these streams. And like he's like, yeah, that food into nowhere analogy is perfect. Like, just kind of totally slips right through. You don't think twice about it, but just the sheer volume it's crazy. Yeah.
Wait, so you could tell us more about where that nowhere looks like? What is nowhere like?
Yeah.
Nowhere is extremely smelly and and gross and sludgy and um, basically at the transfer station, yeah, we get these bags and we sort through them, and I actually haven't visited the facility where they take all the compost and where they take all the garbage and recycling. But what kind of gets me about it is talking about efficiency. It's just kind of crazy how every morning these trucks go out there, they collect, and I live in Guelph right now, and they collect from several thousand houses what they've thrown out for the whole week and take this volume. And I mean, it has to be just in like the thousands and thousands of kilos to this small land area and dispose of it in these very specific ways. It's really impressive, but it's also just kind of demented in a weird way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, that it is absurd to think about, like, the amount of people who are eating food and producing food waste. Not even food waste, just like all kinds of waste, just bodily, just water, like, yeah. and it's all working right now.
Mm.
But at any point, it could all come crashing down too, as we frequently talk about, because in systems, there's always the risk of catastrophe. There's always risk of some environmental change or factor leading to, an exposure of a vulnerability, that's central in holding kind of all the other things that the system is dependent on, and things crashing down. But there is a way to avoid that to avoid that thing. And I've been kind of thinking about that idea for the past week, or for the past 2 weeks, is so at a certain point, like, a complex system will stagnate, and kind of the principles and values that were used to establish the system, they're, let's say, no longer adaptive. Let's say something changes in the environment, there's a new threat, like, I don't know, climate changes, for example, and like one of the values that, like, you hold really dear and sacred because it's holding that system up, and it has held it up for a long time, that needs to be relinquished, right? In order for that system to enter a new state of organization, to become to go through a process of death and rebirth, and I think that is, like, that process is represented in stories as letting go of the sacred. So, like, in Lord of the Rings, in order to defeat, like, Sauron, like, you have to relinquish that, like, powerful, the One Ring, into the fire, in order for, like, revitalization to happen. Or in, like, me and Paul's favorite movie, Moana, like, you go to where your father explicitly told you not to go, and that it was, like, very dangerous, and you go to that place and you break kind of the conventional sacred rules in order to revitalize or overcome that environmental catastrophe. And I think that's like the reason those stories are propagated is because they're true. Like that's how we should react in the face of coming catastrophe, is to let go of some of the values and assumptions that we hold sacred. So like my question to you, Alex, was like, what are some of the values that or practices that we have right now that we either like take just for granted, like it's always been that way, or like that we take to be sacred, that we could relinquish a little bit?
That's a really interesting question, and I haven't actually seen Moana, so I need to do that. I think that there's a lot that I've read about, and I haven't articulated my thoughts enough on this to really give you a great answer. But one of the ones that I'm really interested in is this relationship between the idea of the individual and nature. And so this draws a lot from the work of my committee member Stephen Quilley, who basically he draws from a couple different sources. This guy, I might actually have the book here. Norbert, it's backwards, but Norbert Elias. It's called this civilizing process. Basically talked about the development of how basically I'm not going to go into Norbert Elias, but what Stephen Quilley is saying is basically this idea of the individual. It's really tied with the formation of the state and the development of the self-regulating market. And so basically the idea of the individual is based upon ecological destruction and degradation. And so what he kind of argues throughout his work is that in order to get away from this sort of pattern of self-destruction and to stop this really unhealthy relationship with the earth, we have to go toward, in a very sociological sense, we have to move from an idea of just the individual to an idea of more community, and sort of this shifting in I versus we balance and kind of negotiating that. And so I think this is really cool. There's a lot of trade-offs that come with that, and the whole process of, like he says, the whole process of developing the sense of the individual. It relied on, this formation of the national state and all this stuff that, grants us freedom and grants us individual rights and human rights and all this important stuff, but recognizing that has come at a cost of ecology is something that I think is a really cool way of looking at development and stuff. And so bringing that kind of down to more practical purposes, how can we start to foster a greater sense of like local community and emphasize these sort of micro level communities? I think that's one potential way to do it, and that's particularly why I'm interested in food too, because like the place that June and I worked at, Neighbor to Neighbor Center, had this really empowering and really cool sense of community. And if we could see that sort of in more pockets, and instead of just thinking about myself, I think about myself and others. And if you can do that through food, you might be able to do that through sports or through other dimensions. But yeah, sort of reshifting the unit of analysis from the individual to the community, and that might have some positive aspects on our relationship with the natural world.
Yeah, like the thing I struggle with though is like it needs to be both individual like and community, right? So like, yes, you are an individual with these certain freedoms and these certain rights, and you should be protected by the state, because like one of the assumptions is that the individual human being is of like very great value, or like that's some of like the kind of founding principles of, I guess, the nation states that we have right now, or many of them. And it's been remarkably successful in some ways when you elevate the individual above all else. But but you're right, that creates a separation between the individual and everything else, like the environment or the community that people are embedded in. I think like in terms of community and like that individual feeling a sense of belonging, I think a lot of those problems of like sharing food or like engaging in common sports and activities, I think those problems have, for the most part, been solved by culture, or like culture from like different nations, different states are the like collected mass of solutions for those problems that individuals face in living in a social world, right? So like we had a Korean barbecue dinner yesterday for all the Koreans in the MacMed program, and like it just strikes me because um, as much as I'd like to say that, oh, it's easy to just get along and form community with anyone, out there. You can't deny, you can't escape the fact that if you share like a common lineage of food, like similar like appearances, background, like that, and like that common culture, or those series of solutions that's been like kind of spoon fed and handed down to you, um, that makes forming community just like much easier. Um, so like the thing that I've been kind of thinking about was like that I think a part of the part of the solution moving forwards in terms of connecting the individual back to like a sense of community or sense of belonging to the whole, it's going to need to incorporate looking back on your culture and like your own roots, and seeing the kind of solutions and like wisdom of your ancestors that's kind of been forgotten.
Hmm.
I wonder, or I was wondering what you had to, what you thought about that.
That's a great idea. Yeah, two things about that. First part, yeah, you're totally right. Like there are lots of trade-offs that come with the shift of thinking, and a lot of things that aren't necessarily would not necessarily be welcomed by the vast majority of individuals within society. I think, yeah, that's a really important recognition, to not sort of romanticize the community and to not sort of paint it in this really, yeah, this kind of rose light, because it would involve lots of trade-offs. And sorry, the second part to your question was,
it's like, yeah, what do you think about like how we should incorporate culture or our identification with, nation or ethnicity, like moving forwards?
right. Yeah, it's such a tricky thing, because on the one end, if we talk about common culture and those sort of commonalities, inherent in doing that, you exclude others, and so it's like this exclusionary process. But at the same time, it results in less feelings of alienation and maybe a greater connection with nature. So, yeah, finding that balance, I think, is important. And I'm talking a lot about this guy Stephen Quill. You should look at stuff. But what he argues in this working paper that my thesis is based on is basically that these sort of advanced forms of technology, things like vertical farming, things like aquaponics, effectively the idea behind them is to make food almost infinite, in the sense that you can totally isolate them from the broader natural world, and you can effectively make these commodities non-rivalrous in the long term. Yeah, meaning like, yeah, they're not, a dart's not going to go wipe them out of pestilence. It's not going to happen. So if we sort of democratize these different technologies and these capital intensive ways, and these really novel ways of producing food, for example, and you combine that with these community oriented sort of social structures, effectively you create a condition in which you can kind of have that balance of individual and community. Now, how that would actually work out in practice, I'm not too sure. But and there's always the cautionary note. We shouldn't appeal to technology to solve all our problems. But I think there is something to be said for the potential to sort of take things like advanced digital automated technologies that have traditionally been, formed in this very conventional way and have been circulated in this very conventional way. I think there's something to be said for taking them and sort of radically changing how they're distributed, to whom they're distributed, and what way as a community or as an individual you could organize your economic and daily lives around those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there is a wave of those kind of decentralizing technologies that are coming. So, like, just starting from a few years ago, we've had something like the 3D printer. Like, it might seem just like a obscure, like, kind of cool thing, but what it does to some degree is bring the means of production, like for 3D printing, like back to individuals, as opposed to being completely dependent on a centralized manufacturing source for that. Or there's the rise of blockchain technologies and the idea that you'll be able to have transactions that are safe and guaranteed without a centralized body like a bank that has to print out the money for you and regulates its ebbs and flows. So I think there's a lot going in that direction, and a lot of potential for those kind of different technologies to come together to produce something that maybe we've never seen before. And maybe one of those experiments will be radically successful, but
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. But how do you experiment with those kind of ideas in your daily life? Because Paul and I really we always have these very very deep broad discussions, and then we're like, okay, so what do we do now?
Now, I struggle with that too so much. The one thing that I've done recently, and I haven't been able to really go for it yet. There's a community in Guelph. It's called Diode, and it's a makers society. And so I don't know if you guys know much about maker movement, but yeah, basically this sort of kind of going along with like DIY, like repair and sort of the kind of looking at these very like things like technology and the means of production in a very community oriented way. And so I signed up with them, and I haven't really started making stuff yet. I don't know what the heck I'm gonna make, but yeah, I think that's maybe one strategy is start finding these sort of alternative, sort of outside the box thinking, because they do exist, or even I don't know, starting your own too. I don't know. Yeah, I guess that maybe one way, and then another way, just reading. Like I've been blown away by the amount of stuff that not only that I have read, but that I've found out that I need to read, and all these like really new ways of thinking about the world and thinking about ways to do these sort of unique combinations, because a lot of people are thinking about similar things, and it's worthwhile checking them out.
So I just wanted to clarify some things. So it seems like a big part of this is taking on individual responsibility, and eventually becomes a priority for us to consider things like the environment and how we interact with nature and things like that. So is that a fair assessment to say that the first step is to take responsibility and learn as much as possible?
Yeah, I like that a lot. And I've talked with Gene about this before, but yeah, that's part of the reason why I really love, dare I say his name, Jordan Peterson, is because he kind of goes in that direction about taking individual responsibility and the need to do that to make a better world around you. I think that's a really cool way to think about it.
And like part of, I think, like Jordan's message that isn't like articulated as much or really shared as much, is there's this, you know, I think a lot of his message like surrounds the individual and the like value of the individual. But like in some of his videos, he'll talk about like how radically connected just one individual is, right? So like we're all sources of connections to, like, you know, in this day and age, like hundreds, thousands of people, and like just one more degree of separation away from that is like on the order of like millions, right? So like we live in this like very interconnected world, and like I think, yeah, it blows me away sometimes. Like I saw like BTS, who's like, I don't know if you've heard of BTS, Alex, but like they're a Korean boy band that did a world tour, and like, you know, they had 3 shows in Hamilton, all in First Ontario Center. All nights were sold out, and it just amazed. It just like blew me away how like willing people are, how gravitated people are towards, you know, others who are creative or like expressing themselves in a real way in the world. And when you mentioned that thing about like the maker movement and being creative, I think that's an aspect of ourselves, of like individuality, that has been kind of lost because of the culture of consumerism, because of, you know, we're always consuming content and we're not the ones creating it. If you kind of relinquish that creative power and potential to corporations and government, then you know, maybe you're not living your full life. So I think that's one really interesting avenue that I'd like to explore more. And I guess this project is a part of that. So like creating something in the world and kind of expressing a part of yourself or your ideas in like a real tangible way, trying things out is very important. And I after having said this, I should like hold myself more to account, to create things and express things and share things.
Mm.
Yeah,
That's really cool. Yeah, it's really powerful, that idea that I hadn't really considered. I haven't really thought of how creativity is intrinsically tied to, yeah, like as an individual, how can I be creative to influence my broader community moving forward? And that's something that I can definitely, it's definitely something I need to work on, and something that I hope to work on, because, you know, just like everyone, oh yeah, I'm guilty of mass consumption of Netflix and mass consumption of yeah, and YouTube. So yeah, I think that's definitely a strategy. How do you think that as an individual you can creatively think about nature?
Creatively think about nature.
Mm.
Is it,
Mm-hmm.
is it would you rely on illicit substances to help you with this journey, or are there other ways?
Not illicit anymore.
Yeah, not illicit anymore.
There you go.
Yeah. See, okay, so one thing that I find really interesting about like the legalization of marijuana in Canada is, so like the common drugs we have available right now to the public is like alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, and those, as far as I know, have no like explicit psychoactive properties. And what I find really interesting about marijuana is that like it, at higher doses, it does have like mind altering, let's say, properties. And I think people have been using those substances to, or not using, but one of the consequences may be like a closer connection to nature, for example. So if you like smoked a joint in nature and you were relaxed, and you were kind of more attuned to like how beautiful things were and like how harmonious things were, you know, then probably could give you a greater sense of appreciation for things like that. And this like plant now being legal to the Canadian public, I think we're the second nation on earth like to legalize a substance, and like I think that's a big accomplishment. I think there's a lot of different avenues, or it opens up, but I'm not quite sure what the consequences are going to be. I actually like, yeah, I don't know how big of a factor the legalization of marijuana will be. Like I think it's been basically treated as legal for quite a time now. But yeah, that's an interesting point about the use of illicit substances. What do you think, Paul?
Yeah, I think there was a bit of a change in the question there, or the answer. Maybe becoming more open to the substances will help us be more open-minded towards taking risks and being more creative, and having some more individuality in terms of what you can do. And freedom is often a good thing as long as it's tempered by responsibility. And so when you're given individual responsibility, oftentimes if you can handle it, it's great, it's good for you. Even me, so I've been against using any sort of illicit drugs for a very long time, and as I get older, I feel more open to it because I guess I'm just open to more experiences, and I've had more experiences in other realms, and that's made me think, why not take this extra step? It's not the end of the world, and it might be something new and something helpful too. Although it will still take me some time before I open up to some of the other things that June has taken. We can talk about that another day. To go back to the question though about thinking creatively about nature, I think a lot of this has to do with, again, thinking about consequences. So, there's a lot of things you do in the day-to-day basis that affects nature and affects the environment that you never see. And what might be helpful to both you and the community is to think about, what repercussions your actions have. Even something like this, right? So we're using technology to communicate from far, far away, and we're using energy, and we're actually even using energy from food to have this conversation, to think, and all this kind of stuff. A lot of considerations, but of course the benefit of doing this is that we get to engage in conversation, we get to build relationships, and we get to share these ideas and become, better human beings, I would even say.
More woke.
Sorry?
More woke.
We're becoming more woke, yeah. Stay awake, stay woke, sheeple. But and so in that case, I think the benefits outweigh the cons. But that sort of awareness makes this more valuable, I think, because now we're saying, okay, there are limited resources. We're taking this time aside. We could be doing other things, but this is what we choose to do. And we recognize that there are consequences, but we think this is so important that we're going to overlook them, or we're going to take ownership and take responsibility for this and get the most out of this experience. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't get to do on a day-to-day basis. Things happen to them. They don't realize the cost of it, of every experience. Things just happen, and they just take it as it is. And, you're not making the most out of the moment. So that's one thing I think would be helpful in thinking about the next time we're doing something that is resource intensive, or just anything really.
That brought up a like kind of a interesting association in my mind. So the way we conceptualize value is like very tied to money, the idea of currency. So when businesses account for like the cost of things, it's all in monetary value, and kind of the non-monetary consequences that are hard to calculate are just kind of cast aside as externalities. So all the harms that you do to the environment or any other cost to like people's quality of lives, for example, they're all externalities and they don't find a place in that accounting book, that balance of costs and benefits. And like, I think what you're pointing to is, can we evaluate the true cost of something instead of using money as an abstraction of like value itself, right? But if we start to kind of break that down and say like, okay, like what are the costs, what are the true costs to the things that we value, like as a consequence of this, like it's very tedious. Like it can kind of span infinitely, like you can't predict every single cost and every single consequence. But I do think it's a good cognitive exercise to get you thinking about true costs of things and not always resorting to money as, the main consequence or the main reward. So.
What would be some other accounting frameworks that we could use, like besides money, like happiness, time?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's hard. Like for me, I started to incorporate like the idea of value and what I value to be, this kind of qualitative subjective dimensions a lot into my accounting. So right now in Hamilton, like I decided to live in, like rent is fairly like twice as much as I used to pay in undergrad. But like when I saw the house, I saw it was like very beautiful. Like the landlord had lived here for a year and he does like renovation things, and like, he spent a lot of time and effort to make the home like look and feel beautiful. And I saw that, and I kind of fell in love a little bit, and I asked myself, okay, like coming home every day, like maybe studying on campus, how much will I value and how much will I appreciate like this home and this environment that I come to? And like the value of that is like, it completely justified like the payment. Maybe I didn't think too much on the payment and the consequence side of things on that end. But yeah, but that was one example of like where I shifted my priorities to the things I value and the things I find beautiful. And that's the way of thinking. Or like, I really want to get a new iPad. Like this is very consumeristic. like the iPad is a piece of technology that like I use on a daily basis and probably for like 5 hours a day. And like compared to like any other product or like on Amazon that I buy, like the amount of value that I get from this in terms of learning, in terms of entertainment, in terms of scheduling, admin, like that will in the long term like vastly outweigh the costs. And cost, okay, I'm thinking about this in terms of money, which is not so great, but that financial cost to me, there's probably, the cost to, I don't know, contributing in some small way to the American like industrialized economy. I'm contributing in some way to mal-labor practices in China and other, third world countries that are producing this iPad. Those are consequences I'm all aware of, and maybe I can't escape from at the moment. But I'm very grateful for those sacrifices, whether it was intentional or not. And I'll keep that in my accounting framework when I extract value or when I derive value from my usage of this product. Because then the product takes on like a whole new meaning, right? Like it's not just cool technology thing pumped out by this really great company. It's like no, it's a product of a very faulty and maybe catastrophic way of doing things. But right now, it's the best we have, and it's on you to make things better for the future, so that we can have this amazing technology and maybe amazing labor conditions, and that being integrated in a system where you can appreciate each other and nature and the value of things in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's well put, and I'm just being a little bit mindful of the time. I want to throw it back to you, Alex, for maybe a final word on the things you value and the things you think are important for maybe all of us to value moving forward into the future.
I think we covered a lot of bases in this conversation, and I think that thinking to sort of some of the main themes, the one that I'm really excited about, and the one that I haven't been thinking enough, and that you guys have done a great job of illustrating, especially through this this venue and this conversation, is creativity and sort of putting products out there, and not products, not a commercial product, not an iPad, but putting out these new forums for discussion and putting out your thoughts and your discussions. I think that's important. And the one thing that I'm really conscious of navigating and conscious of understanding is this relationship between myself and community, and what, on a broader scale, what trade-offs that entails. And so especially when we're talking about nature and about our relationship with nature. And so more specifically for that one, I guess I would say consciously understanding as an individual what responsibility I have, but also within my community what responsibility we have in terms of contributing to our impact on nature more generally. And if that's through food, cool. If that's through other means, it's also cool.
Take more responsibility. Stay woke. This is some good takeaways.
Yeah, and I think, Alex, if you have any ideas or things in the future that you just want to chat about, I think just hit us up. I think this has been a generative conversation, and hopefully we can have more in the future.
I would love that. I've definitely had a lot of fun, and it's nice to talk to these things with other people, not just myself. So,
and it sounds like we have a lot more to talk about. So,
yes,
So we'll get to it.
All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Bye.